classes of processes and their processes instances. Now we know the difference between a class of process and an instance of that class of process is that the class of process is the pattern, is the model, is the frame that we've designed so that we can start running several instances of that class of process. So I can create one class of process and I can call it, for example, I don't know, vacation request. And every time someone in the company, for example, an employee, requests their vacation, that's going to be a process or an instance of the class of process. So the first thing we want to learn to identify or to find within the database is the classes of processes and the instances or the processes that are generated of those different classes of processes. So the first one we're going to look at is the table procesos clases. This table contains a lot of data related to the class of process. And I just want to highlight a couple important columns. For example, here we have this column called ID. And this one contains a unique identifier for each class of process. And actually this unique identifier, we're going to see it in the reference of the class of process. For example, here we can see the reference of this class of process is ST101, and that's because the ID, the internal ID, is number 10. Okay, so we're always going to see this reflected in the reference. Besides, we're also going to have these two other columns. One of them obviously contains the reference, and the other one contains a unique value for all the versions of the same class of process. So for example, here, where we can see it's got number 1, and it's got this number 1 in 4 different rows within the column. This means that all 4 of these classes of processes are all of the same version. So first I had version number 1, then I had version number 2, then I had version number 3, and then I had version number 4. So we know that this class of process has been versioned, and currently it's in its 4th version. We can tie them all together with this unique identifier that is repeated in all of these different rows. Now here we can see we've got another class of process. It's called Gen61 in the reference, and the number that appears here is number 6. And this one has a similar reference, but this one's number 7. So we know they're 2 totally different classes of processes. All right, so here we can find all these key values. So we have the ID, we have this value that allows me to know which classes of processes are of the same version, and here we have the references. If I want to make sure I'm working with the correct class of process, I can always enter the application, the platform, and I can search for the reference. So if I go to structure and I enter processes and I go to chain classes, I'm always going to be able to check this grid here and find the different references. So this way I can cross the information here with the information that I have in my table, and I know I'm actually searching for the data in the correct place. Okay, now we're going to check another table that's called processes, procesos. And this one is going to contain rows for each instance that has been launched of all the different classes of processes. And here we have several key values that we need to know in order to find the data. For example, we have an ID, and this is the unique identifier for each instance, for each process. And we're also going to see that reflected here in the reference. So in the reference, we have the reference with the ID 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Okay. Now, we also have a column that has the ID of the class of process. This means that it has the same value for each class of process. It can be used for filtering or relating all the processes of the same class. So for example, here, if I put where, and I try to find within this column all the instances that are launched of the class of process with the ID number 1, well, I would be able to filter that information. Besides here, it's quite obvious, we can see the base reference. Okay, before we were seeing the reference of the class of process, and here we're seeing the reference, the base reference of the instance of every single process. Now, in this example, we've applied a filter. We can see here we've added where ID clase proceso is equal to 5. Okay, so here we're saying only display the rows that belong to the class of process with the ID number 5. And besides here, we're saying, or we could also say, we want to search where the reference contains st14 because we know that this is the reference of the class of process. And if we add a percentage, it means it doesn't really matter what appears behind because it's always gonna, just add them all to my result list. So any of these two filters would be useful in order to find all the instances of one unique class of process. Here in the first one, I'm using this column here, filtering by the class of process with ID number 5. And in this other example, I'm using the reference, and all I'm saying is, well, I want to use the reference of the class of process, but the ID of the instance, it doesn't really matter. I just put a percentage, and that way it just finds all of them. Okay. I'm going to search for the classes of processes and for the processes. So I've gone to this database here. It's called Schoolmaster. And the first table I want to open is this one here that's called Procesos Clases. So I'm going to click here on the first 1000 rows, and I'm going to try to focus on one of these classes of processes. So I'm going to enter the platform. I'm going to my tasks, and here I can see I have draft in my task inbox, and it's got the reference 1311. So I can find it here. I could actually filter the data. So I could go here and say from, and then I could put another filter, for example, where the reference is like, let me see if I can use the reference. So it is called referencia. This would be the column. And now I want to say it has to contain a certain number. So I'm going to go to the platform, and it's got to be the 13.1. So I'm going to say, well, if the reference is 13.1, I'm going to execute. And here we've got all the information of this class of process. So it's got the reference 13.1, and it's got the ID 13. I can find more information like the name, when it was created, and so on. But now I'm going to go to this other table that's called Procesos. And here, I'm going to do the same thing. I want to find only the processes of a certain class. And here we also got the column reference or referencia. So I'm going to click here on, I'm going to add the statement that says where it's like, and I'm also going to add here, it was 13. I'm going to execute. And now here, I can see I've got several instances, several processes that I've launched of the class of process 13. No, 1 second, this is not correct, because the reference here, the reference of the class of process should be 13, okay? So I'm actually looking for something different. Here we can see it's ATS/13.1, and that's what I wanted to find here. There we go. Let's see if now I can find it. Here we go. Actually, there's only one. So there's only one unique instance launched of this class of process. Okay, let's do something. Let's run a test. So I'm gonna try to launch another one. So I'm gonna click here on Start Process. I'm gonna filter by the reference. And I'm gonna add some information here. Okay, I just launched the process. I still have a draft here. Let me check. Let me update here. And there we go. So we've actually launched 2 instances. So now we have 2 rows here. And we might be asking, okay, what or how do we know which one of these instances is a draft? Well, we can know because of the information we have in a certain column. I think it would be this one here. I think number 7 is a draft. Okay, so if I go to the documentation in our knowledge base, I can always look up for all this information. For example, here, I search for this document. It's called Finding Process Data in SQL Database. And let's say I'm looking for draft. So what value does it have when the draft hasn't started? It tells me that in this column here, ID estado, if it has the value 7, that means it's a draft. Okay, so here we can see this would be the row that belongs to the draft. So maybe we've launched several processes, but we also have several drafts. So they'd all appear here as drafts. Let me make sure. So I'm going to go back into the platform. I'm going to start another process. But this time I'm not going to submit it. All I'm going to do is exit. And now here we can see I've got 2 drafts. I'm going back to the SQL table. And here we can see both of these have number 7. Okay, so we know that they're drafts. Now, how do we know that it's not a draft? For example, it's default data. Because when we add default data to a process, to a class of process, we're also going to have a row here in this table. Well, I can always go to the documentation. And here I'm going to look for default data. And it tells me when it has a value 8 in this column here, that means that it's a row that belongs to default data. Perfect. Well, I could filter. I could say, well, I want to filter. I'm going to copy the statement. And instead of this column here, I'm going to look into the column ID estado. So this is the column I want to look for. And now I want the value 8. Okay, I'm going to run. So we can see here there's a lot of classes of process that have default data. Okay, I can also check this. For example, I'm going to go to this class of process that's ATS21. So I'm going to open it here in structure, processes, 2.1. I think the reference has a little dash here. There we go. Now, if I enter the configurations, I should find in the star message event default data. There we go. So we know there's some default data here. And that's why there's a row appearing here with the ID number 8. Okay, so this way we can know the status of each one of these instances, if they are actually default data, if it's a draft, if it's a running process. If we want more information, we always can go to the knowledge base and check for more information. As we can see here, in the knowledge base, we've got all kinds of different documents. If we search for this one here, it's going to help us figure out a lot of things. Okay, with this, we've completed this section. We're going to continue with the next one.